I've been writing for 20 years. My first book, Sugar, was published in 2000. I started writing very early. I would say around the age of 7 or 8. And when I say writing, I'm using that word quite loosely. I loved to read. My mother taught me to read at around the age of 4 or 5, and I immediately fell in love with it. So for years, I was reading along to Disney recordings, which I don't know if they still do that. That's back in the days of vinyl. And when I was about 8 or 9, I discovered my mother's stash of books. And these were racy books that a 9-year-old probably should not have been reading, but I was reading them. And at that point, I decided that I wanted to be a writer. So I'm writing my little stories, and I'm taking a lot of the text from my mother's books. I wrote a story that was as racy as the stories in one of her little dime store books, and it was concerning for her. She wanted to know if I had experienced the things that were in the story, and I had not. And again, I was 9. So going forward, I'm still reading, I'm still stealing her books. I'm now very much into Stephen King. And even though I enjoy horror, I wasn't interested in writing horror. Now, as a Black child in the 1970s, going to school, the chapter books that I was given weren't written by people of color. And the characters in the books weren't people of color. And I had heard that there were Black writers at some point, but people didn't write books. So even though I had this dream to become a writer, I really didn't have a model. So the years went by. I went off to boarding school, mostly white boarding school, Catholic boarding school. So my beloved Stephen King books were not allowed in that school. A lot of what we brought in, a lot of the literature was censored. I was forced to read the great novels by a lot of dead white people. And even though the language in some of those books I found beautiful, I couldn't appreciate the stories. And again, I was not reflected in those stories. So I graduated in 1983, and I came back to Brooklyn, which is my home. And there was this battered copy of The Color Purple by Alice Walker. And I picked it up and I read it from cover to cover in one day. And it just blew me away because I knew all of those characters. They were so familiar to me because my grandparents and my great aunts and uncles had migrated up from the South. So I'd heard all of those stories around the dinner table, during Thanksgiving and Christmas. And so the characters just jumped off the page. That renewed my interest in becoming a writer. So continued to read, continued to write. And in 1990, 1991, I enrolled in an undergrad program at Fordham University. And I was supposed to be taking business courses because I wanted to advance my career. I was in travel and tourism industry. But the only thing I signed up for were courses that had to do with writing, creative writing, poetry, journalism. And it was in my very first creative writing class that my creative writing professor, who has since gone on to greatness, she's passed on, her name is Dr. Margaret Lamb. She took me aside at the end of the first semester. She had been encouraging for the 3 months that I was in class with her, but she took me aside and she said, I don't know why you are not published. And that really did something to me because I was wavering. I was starting to think that maybe writing was the thing I was supposed to do with my life. And so with that renewed interest, I went home and I started pulling out short stories that I've been working on and off on for a couple of years. And I started submitting them to different magazines and journals. And I received rejection letter after rejection letter. But even though it was frustrating, I didn't feel like I was going to give up. I knew I had to get better. I knew I had to continue honing my craft. I knew I had to continue reading. And I did that. And a few years went by, wasn't able to sell any of my short stories. And I thought, well, let me gather all these short stories and try to sell a collection of short stories, a whole book of short stories. And so I started sending my collection out, and again, rejection letter after rejection letter. And then I came across a book, and one of the chapters basically said that it was virtually impossible for an unknown writer to sell a short story collection. One would have to sell a novel first. And the novel, that form just seemed like a mountain. I could barely, get out 35, 40 pages. So it was so daunting to think that I would have to write 300 or 400 pages. So I had what we call a coming to Jesus session with myself. I sat down, had a conversation, took out 10 of my favorite short stories, and waited for one of those short stories to jump out at me. And the story that jumped out was Sugar. Now, Sugar had started as a poem. I am not a poet, but I do have poetic tendencies. And so Sugar jumped out at me, and I said, okay, we're going to turn this short story into a novel. And it took me a number of years to do that. It was a lot of writing and reading and talking to the people in my family, because the story takes place in a southern town, and I hadn't spent a lot of time in the South. Over a 10-year period, it took 10 years for me to finally find a home for Sugar. And I have about 76, and these are rejection letters that I kept, so I'm sure I had more than that. But I have about 76 rejection letters. In 1999, though, in February 1999, I sent a query letter to a literary agent on February 9th, 1999. And that day is significant because it's the day my daughter was born, and it's also the birthday of Alice Walker, the author of The Color Purple. And I sent that query letter off, and 2 weeks later, I had a meeting with the literary agent, and he signed me right there on the spot. And even though he signed me immediately, I didn't get excited because I had familiarized myself with the process. And sometimes, you can get an agent, and it takes a long time for the agent to find a home for the manuscript. So I didn't get excited. But 2 weeks later, my agent called me and he said, you have a 2-book deal. And that was the beginning of my life as a published writer. And that was 21 years ago. So I am going to read a bit from my debut novel with Sugar, that's celebrating its 20th anniversary. And I hope you enjoy it. Jude was dead on a day when the air held a promise of summer and people laughed aloud, putting aside for a brief moment their condition, color, and where they ranked among humanity. Jude dangling on the end of childhood and reaching out toward womanhood, should have been giggling with others her age among the sassafras, or dipping her bare feet in Hodges Lake and shivering against the winter chill it still clutched. Instead, She was dead. She'd been taken down by the sharp blade of jealousy, and her womanhood, so soft, pink, and virginal, was sliced from her and laid to rest on the side of the road near her body. Her pigtails, thick, dark ropes of hair, lay splayed out above her head, mixed in with the pine needles and road dust. Her dress, white and yellow, her favorite colors, was pulled up to her neck, revealing the small bosom that had developed over the winter. The murder had white man written all over it. That was only a half-truth, but no one would say it above a whisper. It was 1940. It was Bigelow, Arkansas. It was a Black child. Need any more be said? No one cared except the people who carried the same skin color. No one cared except the parents who had nursed her, stayed up all night soothing and rocking her when she was colicky, applauded her when she took her first steps, and cried when the babbling, gurgling sounds that came from her sweet mouth finally formed the words mama and then later papa. They cared. The parents of sweet, sweet Jude, who would never hurt a fly, no less a human being. Look at what they did to her. Word first came via the Edelson boy. He'd run all the way and was breathless when he arrived. Black John, the blacksmith, had found her about a mile down the road and covered her body with a crocus sack while he put himself in the right frame of mind to start coming. He had to pop the boy moving instead of gawking. Black John remained behind, gathering the broken child into his arms and placing her gently in his wagon among the bags and crates of filled provisions. He stood looking at the beaten child of this almost woman. In life, she was a tall child, strapping like her father, but in death, she seemed so small. Perhaps it was because of her broken bones and the way her skin sank in the places between the breaks that made her look so tiny and uneven. He shook his head in pity and looked up into the heavens for an answer. An hour of blackbirds blinded the sun and then moved on. If that was clarification of why and what lay ahead, Black John never said, but he would think back on this day again in 15 years' time. His wife had helped birth this child, as she had most of the Bigelow children. She would take it hard, like she'd lost one of her own. He looked back at the child again, and a heavy sigh escaped him. No rest for the weary, he muttered, and then couldn't think of why that would come to mind at all. He was procrastinating, standing there behind his wagon of potatoes, turnips, cabbage, yam, and Jude. He was stretching the space between his arrival and the scene that would follow, crying eyes and screaming mouths. He'd seen plenty of grief in his time, but grief let loose from a woman who lost a child, that was the worst type of grief of all. If you could, you'd try to avoid that sort, because grief that comes from a loss of child just took a piece of you away each time you met up with it. And if you found yourself among it too often for too long, you'd certainly die way before your time. No, Black John was in no hurry to go. The sun sat watching curiously on its perch, delaying its descent into late afternoon. It was long past 3, and Black John's shadow stood stout before him, watching and waiting. He removed his straw hat, the one that belonged to his daddy before him, the one he inherited when his uncle handed it to him with a quiet word. Black John could never remember the exact word that was spoken, but it left an emptiness in him. The strawberry-colored stain stiffening the center part of the hat's hump confused him more than scared him, because his daddy hated strawberries. Black John fingered the stain and looked back at the dead child, her dress blotched with her own strawberry stains. Well, he muttered in resignation as he pulled his handkerchief from his pocket and wiped the sweat from his brow and the back of his neck. He moved to the cab of the truck and removed a second empty crocus sack from the floor. Returning to Jude, he looked her over once again and shook his head in pity, and then tucked the crocus sacks around her body and went to the left of the wagon. That's when he saw it, glistening in the sun. His shadow stepped forward and shaded the glare. Black John knew immediately what it was, although he had never seen one without a woman's support, protection, and guidance behind it. Something like that, once seen, always known. He leaned down and with the sweat-soiled handkerchief, retrieved Jude's womanhood. He would later recount, and he often did, how it quivered in the palm of his hand. His mule closed the distance in a slow saunter that barely disturbed the road. Black John looked over his shadow, and his shadow looked back at him. Ahead, he could see the small pond of black faces, eyes big with wanting to know, eyes big with wanting to see. Black John rode right into the middle, and when he stepped down from his wagon, he was 6 years old again. His father's straw hat, with the strawberry stain stiff and dry on its hump, in his hands. He pushed through the worn and patched sea of skirts, fought through the tree-long legs of men, and bit down hard on a hand that tried to cover his too young for death eyes. When he made it to the clearing, there was his father, beaten so hard and for so long that his skin had bubbled up purple. The top of his head was open, and there he saw precious memories and somehow someday dreams wrapped in I love you colors spilled out for all of Bigelow to see. Then came the wail, and Black John lost a little bit of his time on earth. That's what scared him now, the silence, the absence of that mournful homage that broke your heart, stole time from Black John, and pushed the most pious to question God. Pearl's mouth hung open, but no sound came out. Her heart had broken into tiny pieces that rose up, plugging her throat, allowing only breath to pass. She tried again when Black John laid Jude's battered body to rest at her feet, the beaten, brutalized, eyeless body of her baby girl, but all she could do was claw at her own eyes and scratch at her throat, drawing blood instead of sound. Pearl was fighting with the reality that there would be no more candy-sweet kisses and hugs that could magically erase a problem, worry, or fear. In the halls of their home, who would skip, dance, and sing so loud that the dogwoods would raise their branches in delight? Who would call her Mama Honey Baby in that teasing, innocent voice that only Jude possessed? And there would no longer be a reason for her to answer, Jude, baby, doll. These thoughts ran through her mind until her head ached with grief. Searing hot tears fell heavy from her eyes and landed on her bosom, soaking through the black cotton dress and white brassiere, stinging her skin and scorching her heart. The pain, the pain. Later, she turned her face towards the heavens, unable to bear the sight of the sorrow-faced men as they covered her baby's coffin with brandy-brown dirt. She had prepared herself to be taken from the earth at the very moment she heard the muffled sound of the first shovelful hit the top of the small wooden box. She had asked the Lord to release her from this life and allow her to walk beside her sweet Jude as she entered the kingdom of heaven. But with each shovelful of earth, the sound that marked where Jude lay quieted, and with the last sprinkling, Pearl swayed suddenly and was aware of being lifted from the ground. She smiled, believing the Lord had answered her prayers. She quickly opened her eyes to take in, for what she thought to be the last time, the faces of her husband and two sons. And they were there, faces pinched with concern and grief, as they hoisted her up and carried her limp body away from the graveside. She lay in her bed for nearly 30 days, taking in very little food or water, calling for Jude and crying when her call was not answered, and still, as she wallowed in grief and anguish, the sorrowful wail that was reserved for mothers who've lost their only daughters remained locked in her throat. Pearl eventually returned to her life, now absent of Jude. People stopped talking about it and allowed the matter to slip into the space in their minds reserved for horrors like those. She attempted to do the same, putting her pain not behind her, but beside her, where her sweet Jude would have been, and prayed not for redemption, but for salvation. No, the Lord would not answer her prayers on that day, not as she had wished. She did not die, not physically. Her soul and spirit had departed our world the moment she touched the cold, bruised brow of her child. But God would keep her walking and breathing for quite a few more years to come. He had work for her to do. Thank you. We have reached the portion of the show. We've reached the writing portion of the show, yeah? Okay, so prompt number 1. Write a story that opens with a heart-stopping first sentence, followed by a descriptive paragraph that employs the 5 basic senses: sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. So from my reading, I think that my opening is heart-stopping and it makes a promise. Jude is dead, and I fulfill that promise by the end of the novel. So think about when you're browsing for books. How do you browse for books? I open a book and I read the first paragraph, and if it's gripping, that book ends up in my cart. So I'd like you to take a try, see how you do. And we get 10 minutes? 10 minutes? Okay. So I'm going to take my face off and come back.
And Bernice likes to write in silence. So today we are also going to write in silence along with Bernice. I'll let you know when the 10 minutes are up.
So we are going to move on to the second piece, the second prompt. Okay, write 3 short paragraphs. The first, fear, the second, anger, and the last, pleasure, without using these words. Try to render these emotions by describing physical sensations or images. Try to make your language precise and fresh. 10 minutes for this.
Yes, we'll write for another 10, and then after we're done writing, we'll clap, and then we'll get into the sharing.
Okay, good luck.
Hi, Miss McFadden. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
It's Marlena. Thank you for reading my piece.
Oh, okay.
I was like, I couldn't get my picture up there. I was trying, but I'm not tech savvy. So I just wanted to ask you, do you do self-imposed deadlines, and are you like beholden to these deadlines when you're writing the first draft or the second draft? I find myself doing that, and then I get a little upset with myself when I don't meet certain word count or anything like that. Maybe I should shift it and, not even worry about a word count, just write every day anyway. But do you do that, and does it affect your writing?
I do not put deadlines on myself.
Mhm.
The only deadlines that I adhere to are the ones that my publisher gives me.
Okay.
So if I'm not under contract, I just write at my own pace.
I
And,
see.
and let me say this also, because I know a lot of you have been told that writers write every day.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I think that's the worst type of advice. I do not write every day.
I
The
don't either,
story
yeah.
is always with me. I'm thinking about the story every day, but I am not physically sitting in front of my computer and writing every day. And I have 15 novels. So
Right.
I think that when aspiring writers are given that information, um, it it throws up a block, because then you feel like, well, I must not be a real writer because I'm not writing every day.
Right.
So
Right.
I hope that helps.
It does. It certainly does. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We have a lot of questions in the chat. I just want to pass it to Lulu, who has raised her hand. Lulu, are
Okay.
you still there?
Hi, thank you so much for being with us tonight. So I have a question about, when you there's a situation that might or might not be common among writers where you develop the beginning of the story and then you have the end, but then how do you get through the middle part?
Um, so when you sit down to write, you already know the beginning and you already know the end. Is that what you're saying?
Right, and then, yeah, you have to get from point A to point B, and you don't know what to do in between.
Okay. So let me tell you, everyone has a different process. I may know the end of the story. I don't always know the end of the story, but I have to start someplace. Now, I don't write in a linear fashion. I write all over the place. So what I do is at the end, when I know I've reached the end of this particular journey, I then have to sit down and piece everything together. I think the easiest way for you to fill in the middle is to sit down and really just listen to what your characters are asking you to do, and try not to impose your own will onto the story. That's one way. Some people outline. Have you tried outlining?
Yeah, I have in the past. It doesn't really work for me because then I don't really stick to the plot points that I
You don't
outline.
have to. You don't have to stick to it. See, and I think that's why some people, I don't outline, but I feel like it's a useful tool for folk to, just to keep you on track. You don't have to adhere to everything you've put down on that page. You just need something to map you all the way from the beginning to the end. And if things change along the way, that's fine. Does that help?
Yeah, a lot. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. What's in the chat? Based on your experience, would you say it is nearly impossible to get published without an agent? No, that's not true. There are a lot of boutique publishing houses that are willing to look at submissions, unagented submissions, and Akashic Books, the publishing house I've been with since 2010. They are one of the best, in my opinion. and they are open to reading queries from writers who do not have agents. That was Ozma's question. Jamila asked, what inspires you to write? How do you get started? Any techniques for cultivating ideas? I'm inspired to write. I really love history. So whenever I come across some historical content that interests me, I usually pursue it. With the Book of Harlan that was published in 2016, back in 2004, I went to a reading where I learned that Black people were in the death camps in Germany. And that was something that I was unaware of. It made perfect sense, but I had not been taught that in my history class. So that was an inspiration. How do you get started? Getting started is difficult, even 20 years later. You sit down, you create your space, and just tell yourself, I'm not going to get up from the chair until I have at least. Any techniques for cultivating ideas? Well, I go back to history. Has a wealth of ideas, and my own family history. I do a lot of genealogy work. Swati, we did not have a third prompt. We only had two. Alex asks, how often did you write when you were writing your novel, and how did you keep yourself motivated? When I was writing Sugar, I probably wrote five evenings out of the week. And I would only write at night because my daughter was very young and I worked all day. So I'd come home, take a nap, deal with her, and then I'd write until like 1 or 2 in the morning. How did I keep myself motivated? I wanted it. And I knew that this was the life that was meant for me. And that's how I remained motivated. Have you ever been afraid to start writing at all? If so, how did you get through it? Not afraid. Thank you, Kaylee. Not afraid, but sometimes just lazy. Sometimes I'm just lazy because it takes a lot out of you. Deborah Carter, one of my mentors, Elizabeth Nunez, she is also my mentor. She told me to write at least 500 words per day. Yeah, that's the way Elizabeth works. And we've had this conversation, and whenever I tell her my process, she always says it makes her very nervous. But I think you will find your own grooves. So you try, we'll recommend things, and you try it, and you'll find one that works for you. Ms. St. Fort, hi, I'm interested in pursuing creative writing in college, but I'm kind of on the fence about it. I was wondering, how did studying writing in college help you as a writer? Okay, so I am self-taught. I learned how to write by reading. And I took 2 years of creative writing in Fordham, and I was, in my mid-20s when I did that. And what did that do for me? I think it expanded. It expanded upon what I was reading. Up until that point, I was just reading novels written by Black women. And so Dr. Margaret Lamb was a white woman. And so she introduced me to these other writers, and that helped to expand my knowledge, and it helped to, there's so many different genres out there. And so it helped me kind of to climb out of the box that I had been writing in. I know that creative writing programs are a big thing, and clearly I teach creative writing, but I don't want aspiring writers to feel like they have to go to college in order to become successfully published. You don't. I think it's something like if you have it, you have it. Miss Ortiz, how did you know this was what you wanted to do with your life? I always say that, you know, writing chose me. From the age of 9, I knew that this is what I wanted to do. Deborah Carter, Miss McFadden, do you have a limit to the number of characters in a story? I get lost when there are too many. I do not. Book of Harlan is filled with so many characters. I think that if the author writes well, then you're not going to get lost. And since sometimes, if you're not really interested in the story, you might get lost. But no, I don't limit myself. Whoever shows up, I put them down on the page. Carolyn says, I remember Octavia Butler saying something about reading a lot of nonfiction as inspiration. Yes, I do read a lot of nonfiction, but I also read a lot of poetry. Kathleen Hully, do you ever work in groups with other writers with whom you share and discuss your work? No, I do not. I just don't do that. I didn't come up doing that. I know a lot of writers who do, and that works for them. But I'm not interested in sharing my work that way. Lulu, how do you balance writing with school work if you're not a full-time writer? So I was a full-time writer up until 2016 before I started teaching. And I'm still trying to find that balance. So what I have to do now is I get up at about 4:30 in the morning and I write. Because after teaching all day, I'm not gonna have anything left for myself. So I make time very early in the morning to write. Andrea, feel free to take, oh, okay. Okay, let's see. Kiara, how did you decide on your genre? I feel as though I have too many interests. Why do you have to make a decision? Why can't you write in every genre you're interested in? I write fiction, I write nonfiction.
I guess it comes from, oh, sorry, this is Kiara. I guess it comes from having a background in the journalism world. Like, you know, when I first started, it was always like, oh, okay, Kiara is, you know, really political. We're going to make her a political writer, even though I really wanted to be a music writer.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was like, oh, because I have an afro and wear like, you know, Afrocentric like prints and stuff, all of a sudden I become the political person. So it kind of made me feel pigeonholed to where it was like, okay, I guess I have to pick something, even though I can kind of talk about everything because I enjoy everything. I have many experiences.
Right. There's a famous quote that I'm not going to get it all together right now, but it's something about defining yourself. Is it Audre Lorde? You have to define yourself. Don't let anyone define you for yourself. So if you're interested in writing about music, you should write about music. Creativity is fluid. Miss Minza, my question to you is, do you ever write something but the 5 minutes later you cringe or have what was I thinking moment? I have ideas and writings, but after a while I realize it's not what I want or it sounds bad. How do you deal with those moments? I have published pieces that I go back and read and cringe. I think that's just, you know, you're a human being. And we are our own worst critics. So yes. And I've tossed a lot of stuff. And I'm sorry that I've tossed a lot of stuff because I think it's better just to, you know, put it on a shelf, put it in a drawer and go back to it. I have a story that's coming out in September in a collection called Nicotine Chronicles. And I took that story from a piece that I wrote, a novel actually, that I wrote 15 years ago. And I was like, this is not working. But I kept it. And so years later, it's paying off for me. Haley, what should you focus on when editing your own work? Well, that's a lot. That's like a loaded question. Well, obviously grammar, but for me, I'm all about imagery and the visuals and setting. I would say you do your best edit, like the best you can, but find a professional editor to sit down with, and you're just going to have to pay them, but you want your best writing to shine through. Okay, we'll close out questions after Haley. Thank you, Haley. Thank you, everybody.
There is one more lingering question in the chat, and I feel so bad if we didn't get to it. Can you give any advice to someone who's terrified to show her writing to anyone, but very much wants to move forward as a writer?
That is, I don't know how to tell you to shake that fear. You're afraid of being criticized, possibly. Maybe is that it? Look, this is what my mother and grandmother always told me. People are going to talk about you, even if you don't give them anything to talk about. When you walk out of your apartment every day, when you go to work, someone is criticizing you. This is just the way of the world. And you have to decide if your fear outweighs your desire to be published. That's all I got for you.
Thank you. That's great advice.
Okay.
I feel like I'm going to cry.
That's a beautiful note to wrap up on. Wow. Absolutely amazing tonight. The shares were just incredible. And then Bernice, your advice and your willingness to answer every single question is absolutely amazing. We cannot thank you enough. Can we please, again, all unmute ourselves and just give Bernice the biggest round of applause? Yes. Oh my God. Thank you so much.
Very inspiring.